The subject of this learning guide is developing congressional notifications in support of FMS LOAs pursuant to the Arms Export Control Act, Section 36B. The target audience for this learning guide on developing congressional notifications for 36B cases is implementing agency personnel. We're talking about case managers, country program directors, security assistants, policy analysts in their offices, and program offices that are involved in developing cases after receipt of an LOR and before the offer of an LOA. That's when a congressional notification is prepared. The primary reference for this text is the SAM, Chapter 5.5, which you can link to at the bottom of this slide. Congressional notifications are among the most visible public actions we take in FMS. There's nothing else we do in FMS that results in a Federal Register notice and a press release. Failures in either meeting the requirements or understanding the process and reasoning behind it can lead to congressional notifications that embarrass the administration if they're ill-timed, or that lead to congressional notifications that don't allow you to submit an LOA with everything the country is asking for. So, learning the requirements and understanding the process is more likely to lead to smoother and speedier notifications. The source guidance for this subject is the Security Assistance Management Manual, Chapter 5, Section 5 on Congressional Notification. And through that link, you'll be able to link to the Act and other useful resources supporting this learning guide. What we're going to be talking about in this learning guide, the focus of instruction here is the actual text of the Arms Export Control Act and what it requires, how to develop that information into a draft, how that draft is then handled and staffed in DoD, in the State Department, and on the Hill, and finally, subsequent notifications, which are required after the fact to amend, update notifications that have happened over a period of time. So let's begin. The first objective of this presentation is to familiarize you with the Act itself. Familiarity with the text of the Act makes it an accessible resource, and although I know it's difficult to read legal language, spending a little time going through the link in C5.5 to read Section 36 is useful. There are key words there that are very important in terms of clearly understanding the Act. It's Section 36B that sets forth those legal requirements, and understanding what it requires is a basic necessity for anyone developing congressional notification packages. So Section 36B requires congressional notification before any LOA is issued to an eligible country or international organization at the values indicated below. And it's important to note that the congressional notification is tied to a specific letter of offer and acceptance. So the thresholds for notification values are for NATO member countries, Japan, Australia, Korea, Israel, or New Zealand, commonly referred to as NATO plus 5. The first threshold is a case that includes $25 million or more of MDE. Now, if the MDE total is under $25 million, but the case value still reaches $100 million, a notification is required based on total case value. It's important to note that this is not just the total of the defense articles and services on the case. It includes the total administrative and accessorial fees, the total LOA value. And the contractor will probably be estimating the cost of satisfying an offset in the price of the item on line 1. All these things go into calculating the $100 million total case value. We encourage people generally to round these values up, because there's often things that occur after the fact and you don't want to go back and re-notify. The only caveat on rounding up or offering a high estimate in a congressional notification is that you don't want to surprise the country with a figure that's well beyond what they've been talking about to their legislature or to their finance ministry without making them aware of this. For those NATO plus 5 countries, there's a separate threshold for design and construction services. Those take notification too, but we won't be talking about design and construction services notifications in this learning guide, as they're relatively rare. There is a separate threshold for NATO organizations. NATO member countries are one thing, but a NATO organization, such as the NATO Airlift Management Organization, has a lower threshold together with other countries that are not NATO plus 5 or international organizations. That is $14 million of MDE or $50 million total case value. We'll talk about this term MDE a great deal more in just a minute. But the first requirements that the 36B says is that a CN has to specify these 4 things. If you actually go and look at the copy of the Act, you'll see frequent repetitions or references back to small Roman numerals 1 through 4. And these are what they are. Each CN has to specify the foreign country or international organization to which the defense article or service is offered, the dollar amount of the offer to sell and the number of defense articles offered, a description of the defense article or service offered, and the service or agency which is making the offer to sell. Again, there's slightly different requirements for CNs for design and construction services. Now, the first 2 of these are fairly straightforward, the country or international organization and the service. It's items 2 and 3 where there's some ambiguity. So the dollar amount and the offer to sell and the number of defense articles offered and a description of those articles. Determining whether the LOA value meets the notification threshold depends upon an accurate and complete list of MDE proposed for sale. And the reason for this is because we don't actually notify every defense article and service on a case. If we notified every defense article and service on a case and described it, we would be delivering congressional notifications to the Hill in wheelbarrows. So what we've decided as a matter of agreement is, okay, if we aren't going to list and describe every defense article on the case, what's the red line? What's the threshold beyond which we will not retreat? And the answer to that is MDE. Since Congress has a special requirement for notification based on MDE values, what we require is that we know the actual number or an upper limit and are able to describe defense articles that are MDE in the congressional notification. Other things can be described in more generic terms, but MDE cannot. Every item of MDE has to be counted and has to be described. If it's not specifically identified in the transmittal or is in excess of that quantity, then we have to rescope the LOA down to the congressional notification values before it's offered, or we have to do a subsequent notification to try and adjust that value and make it right. So determining MDE is an incredibly important thing. It's something you have to get right. So what is major defense equipment? How do I know if something's MDE? How must I account for it on a CN? And what happens if I get it wrong? Not only can you not offer the case with re-notification, as I just said, if you do not identify non-recurring costs and seek waivers for those countries for whom there is a loss of sale waiver available, after signature, that waiver is gone. So it can also cost your country a great deal of money. So MDE. I want to stop and talk about this for some amount of time because it's very important for anybody in the business to know terms like major defense equipment, significant military equipment, and understand how Section 36 defines a defense article. Now, if you ask most people what a defense article is, they tell you that it's based on the International Traffic in Arms regulations. A defense article is anything listed or described in a paragraph on the U.S. munitions list. And I'll show you a copy of the munitions list in just a minute so that you can see it. What they don't realize is that that definition in the law is specific with reference to commercial exports. It does not apply to things sold in FMS on a military sale. Section 47 of the Act has a different definition of defense article for military sales. It's long, but the gist of it is any commodity. Anything you sell, any article you sell, any service you sell on a LOA is a defense service regardless of whether it is controlled under the USML or controlled under the CCL by Congress. Everything you sell on an LOA is a defense article by virtue of being one. But that doesn't mean that the definition in the ITAR has no relevance to us. It certainly does. Because that definition of defense article has further subsets that are required for us to understand. The first of those is significant military equipment. Significant military equipment, defined in the ITAR, is articles on the USML for which special export controls are warranted because of their capacity for substantial military utility or capability. Who decides that? It's a combination of state and DoD. And you know it's significant military equipment if you look at the U.S. munitions list and you see a paragraph that describes an item and there's an asterisk in front of it. That means it's SME. If it's described by a paragraph on the USML that doesn't have an asterisk on it, it is still SME if it is classified. And finally, any technical data related directly to the manufacture or production of any defense article that is SME itself. So here's an example. This is what the new Category 7 of the USML looks like. I've deleted sections just to make it fit on the page here. But you can see the initial paragraph here is under Category 7A, tanks and military vehicles, is armored combat ground vehicles, tanks or infantry fighting vehicles. And you can see that at the front of the paragraph is an asterisk, which means that anything that is described by that paragraph is significant military equipment. Similarly, ground vehicles not listed in paragraph A and trailers that are armed or designed to serve as a firing or launch platform are also SME. But ground vehicles and trailers equipped with mission systems controlled under the USML are not. Those are non-SME. So that's what it looks like, and that's how you can identify for sure whether something is SME. But the next category then is, as a subset of SME, is MDE, Major Defense Equipment. Any item of SME, so first of all it has to be SME, on the USML having a non-recurring research and development cost of more than $50 million or a total production cost of more than $200 million. Well, how am I supposed to know that as I'm putting together my CN? And the answer is that federal regulation and DoD Directive 2140.2 say that the military departments are supposed to determine this. As they acquire equipment, they're supposed to determine whether it's major defense equipment and establish a non-recurring recoupment charge. Furthermore, they're supposed to review those non-recurring cost recoupment charges on a biennial basis to determine if they're still correct. Now, for you, that is something of a problem, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But first, let's stop and go back and review that and take a look. Here's a way to remember the term defense article and the subsets that are important to us. First of all, anything on an LOA is a defense article by virtue of being on an LOA. Some of the things on an LOA are also USML articles, and some of those USML articles are SME, significant military equipment, and a subset of those are major defense equipment. That's the sort of hierarchy that we're dealing with. The problem with MDE is that in spite of the requirement that the military departments are obligated by regulation and policy to determine these charges, identify them as MDE, it often doesn't happen until the first FMS sale. Now, when an NC charge has been established, it's listed in Appendix 1 of the SAM. However, although Appendix 1 of the SAM is authoritative, it's not comprehensive. If you find it in Appendix 1, it definitely is MDE. But if it's not there, that doesn't mean it's not MDE, because lack of an NC is not conclusive evidence that it's not MDE. If the owning MILDEP hasn't identified it yet and established an NC charge, it's not in Appendix 1. And so MDE can be missed, especially when you're developing a congressional notification for the first sale of an item. So if I'm developing this draft CN, how do I learn to spot a potential problem? Well, first of all, you learn to recognize in basic terms what's liable to be significant military equipment and be suspicious if the item is SME and there is no military and articles service listing for it in DSAMs. If there is no MASL, then you've got to worry that nobody has looked at it yet in this regard. So be especially suspicious if you're selling something that is a later model or variant of something that is MDE. If it's the Humdinger V1 and the V1 was MDE and you've got to establish a MASL now because you're selling the V2 version, then chances are it's MD as well. One of the problems you have in developing congressional notifications is if the item hasn't been specifically determined whether it's MDE or not, that determination can take time. And if you aren't sure and don't have time for an answer, identify the item individually on the CN as you would if it were MDE and include its value in the MDE total. There's no penalty for you doing this, but there are serious potential problems if you don't and the item later proves to be MDE. You can review a presentation, a learning guide on this issue on the DISAM website that talks in more detail about the ITAR and development of MASLs as a result through the link at the bottom of this slide. So how do I spot a potential problem? Additional common problems in counting MDE that require follow-on notifications can include things like this, not listing MDE spares. As an example, if you look at a missile system, and if you look at Category 4 of the ITAR, you'll find that missile components are non-SME. But if you think about the guidance control unit of something like an AMRAAM, it has a radar, it guides a missile, and that component on its own is described under a different category of the ITAR, of the USML, Category 12, guidance control or missile control equipment. So that is SME on its own separately, and because the development costs of most modern missiles go into that guidance control unit, in fact, the non-recurring cost and development charges for that guidance control unit make it MDE. So if you're selling spares, don't assume a component separate from the platform or separate from the larger unit. Don't assume that it isn't MDE if it performs a function that makes it SME. If it has that capability, the development cost may make it MDE as well. So make sure you're checking for spares. A further great example of this is embedded global positioning, inertial navigation. These are small components that fit into a variety of other things, but they're MDE on their own. Every item of MDE has to be listed and counted separately on the notification, even if it's integral to a platform. If you say, I'm selling 24 F-16s, that's great. But an F-16 has a variety of MDE components aboard it. And if you don't list them on a case, then you have a problem. So you might want to say something like, I'm selling 24 F-16s, and I'm selling 27 engines. 24 will be aboard the F-16s, and 3 will be sold as spares. So make sure you're identifying everything, even if it's integrated, built into a platform. The cannon, the Vulcan cannon on an F-16, is built right into the frame, but separately, it's an item of MDE on its own. When people are developing the non-recurring cost for an F-16, it's based on a particular configuration, and that NC charge for that platform in that configuration includes a listing of all the MDE that's aboard it, and the NRC charges total up to the total for the platform. So that information is available and you can find it. Secondly, don't forget to count training assets that include MDE. This takes us back to missiles again. A captive air training missile may not have a warhead, but it may have a guidance control unit aboard it. Don't assume that something like that includes significant spare parts might not be MDE. And finally, another problem we have with this is failure to count assets that will be used in integration, even if they won't be delivered to the customer. A great example of this is when somebody is selling an aircraft platform and the services will involve integration of certain weapon systems, but the weapons package will come in a separate LOA later. And the integration of those assets, that capability into the aircraft, test assets are going to be needed. And if those test assets are going to be purchased on the case, in other words, purchased on the LOA, our link to what's on the CN is that it's on the LOA. If it's sold on the LOA, even if the customer is never going to touch it, never going to see it, if it's being sold on the LOA, it has to be included in the CN. So don't forget to include those test assets. So this is what the first page of a transmittal winds up looking at. And you can see this is an example of a case for Denmark that was done back in 2000 and published in the Federal Register. So you can see that items 1 through 4 on the transmittal notice, the first page, are identical to sections 1 through 4, small Roman numeral 1 through 4 of the Act. You've got the purchaser, you've got the MDE and the total case value listed there, a description of the services and articles being offered. The MDE ones are counted, and it may be possible that there will be other significant items counted and described, other generic terms used for some of the other things. But the description is there, and finally the military department or service. So that is the basic description. Now, generic descriptions or categories should be used whenever possible for MDE articles and services, particularly in cases where there is no MDE, but you're selling, let's say, 1,000 SME Humvees. Not MDE, perhaps, but SME, you're still going to want to include those and give basic value. But the idea is you're not tied as closely to that accurate count as you are as if we were reporting MDE. So there's an example of what one of the more generic descriptions look like. The next section of 36B says that upon request of either the Foreign Affairs Committees, the President submits a statement covering some 20 other areas of information. If you look in the Act, this is section 36B1A through P, a whole series of things. Fortunately, we don't have to do that in most cases. If they specially ask, we have to, but that's fairly rare. To prevent them from making such requests, CNs routinely include the following 8 items from that list. And this is the order from the statute. We put it in a different order in the justification. You'll see that in a minute. An estimate of the number of USG and civilian contract personnel that will be needed in country, the name of the contractor providing the defense articles and whether there's a known offset agreement. The reason the foreign purchaser needs the defense articles or services and a description of how they intend to use them, an analysis of the impact if it's a sale from stock on military preparedness of the U.S. This is the most important one, I think. Why the proposed sale is in the national interest of the United States. The impact of that sale on the military capabilities of the proposed recipient, an analysis of how it would affect the relative military strengths of the countries in the region and whether other countries would react badly. Do they have comparable items or is this a new capability? And finally, the analysis of the impact of the proposed sale on U.S. relations with other countries in the region. Are we going to scare the neighbors if we sell this? Now, the military justification is the core portion of the transmittal, and it contains these elements derived from 36B1A through P. I should say here that when you see a final copy of a notification published in the Federal Register, it won't say the military justification, it'll say the policy justification. While it's in draft, in DOD, we call it the military justification. When state has the language that it likes, and it becomes formal for the administration, it becomes the policy justification. So the first paragraph of that second page repeats the description from the first page and ends with a sentence that includes the estimated value of the sale. The next section is a brief explanation of why the sale is in the national security interest of the United States. This is a typical baseline example of what we might say, that the sale will contribute to the foreign policy and national security of the United States by helping to improve the security of an important partner. We might say in this case of a NATO ally, which has been and continues to be an important force for political stability and economic progress in the region. Now that is the minimum that we would say. If you in the MILDEP want to have more that's either in the country team assessment or you're getting from the combatant commander that you want to include in your draft version, that's great. Send it along. It all becomes fodder for state to use in its talking points when it goes up on the Hill. But what will happen is it'll be pared down probably to a fairly basic statement, but that doesn't mean, again, that you shouldn't add more. Next, a description of the impact of the proposed sale on regional foreign policy and military developments. Normally, what we hope we're going to be able to say is that the proposed sale of the equipment and support will not alter the basic military balance in the region. And I want to take a minute on this because it's confusing. Certainly, any sale we make to a partner that increases their capability or their capacity is going to change their balance relative to a neighbor. But what we want is for that balance not to shift entirely. If we're selling something to Bandaria's neighbor, we don't want the situation to shift so that suddenly that neighbor has a defining military advantage over Bandaria. If we're going to do that, then we need to make it clear. What we're looking for, again, is something that would enable a fundamental shift, a new capability, or a massive capacity that would change the balance between neighbors. We need a short paragraph explaining why the prospective purchaser needs these defense articles and services, how they're going to use them, and the effect on their capability and their ability to absorb and use the defense articles or services. We don't want to sell them F-16s if they don't have pilots and maintenance crews to be able to absorb the capability. So an example here of a typical statement might be the proposed sale will improve Bandaria's capability to meet current and future threats, provide greater security for critical infrastructure, enhance Bandaria's interoperability with U.S. and allies, making it a more valuable partner, and it'll have no difficulty absorbing these things into its armed forces. Again, feel free to offer a more expansive explanation in that section, but this is sort of the bottom line that we're looking for the notification. The next point is an estimate of the U.S. government and contractor representatives are required in country and the length of time that they'll be there. This is so that Congress has an idea of what this does to the U.S. footprint in the country. State whether any known offset agreements have been proposed in conjunction with the sale, and if yes, attach a classified addendum to the CN called an offset certificate. I'm going to talk about this in a great more detail in just a minute. In fact, though, in FMS, the details of offsets are generally not known until well after LOA acceptance, which is well after congressional notification. So we may know that a country has a policy requiring offsets, and we can note that in the transmittal, but offset agreements are not reported except in the very rare occurrence that the purchaser and a contractor have reached specific agreements by the time the CN is being made, and that very rarely happens. So we would more often say there are no known offset agreements proposed in connection with this potential sale, or we may say that the purchaser has requested them, but at this time we don't know what they are, or we may say that they have a policy, but at this time we don't know exactly what the agreements are. We'll talk about that offset addendum more in a minute. Finally, a statement, if it's a sale from stock, a statement of the impact on the proposed sale on the military preparedness of the United States. We want it always to say that there will be no adverse impact on U.S. defense readiness. That's going to take a huge explanation if the answer is something else. So this is what the policy justification for this sale to Denmark back in 2000 looked like. We have, again, the description and the estimated cost. Sale will contribute to the foreign policy and national security objectives by improving the military capabilities of Denmark, further weapon system standardization and interoperability. They're going to use these munitions to upgrade and support their existing systems, going to contribute significantly to U.S. strategic and tactical objectives by strengthening NATO, and it'll have no difficulty absorbing these things into its armed forces. Again, fairly basic at this point, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't, in your draft, submit more complete answers to those questions. They'll be weeded out in the clearance process between DoD and state by the time it's made. Now, there are several different types of addenda attached to a CN. The most common one is called a sensitivity of technology report. B1 requires that such numbered certifications, by that they mean a CN, shall also contain an item classified if necessary, identifying the sensitivity of technology contained in the articles and services and a detailed justification of the reasons necessitating that sale. So, this happens when you're selling anything that's classified. If what you have to say about the parts of the sale that are classified is classified itself, then you need to highlight that in the draft notification so it doesn't get declassified and published. But the law does allow us, in the case of a classified sensitivity of technology report, to keep that out of the public record. If it's classified, it'll be delivered to Congress, but won't be published in the register. For the most part, sensitivity of technology reports describe the classified defense articles and services and the consequences of what would happen if they're lost in an unclassified format. General enough language that it is not classified, but it can be classified. So that's one type of addendum. So here's an example. The first paragraph, you have to identify two things. Identify and provide the security classification of any classified equipment or components or subsystems, and the security classification of sensitive information or restricted information contained in that equipment. Remember now that your sensitivity of technology is going to congressional staffers, so you need a basic description of what that sensitive piece of technology is and does for them to be able to understand it. And this is for the public too. So again, the explanation has to be basic but complete enough and understandable enough to be useful. So the important information is at the bottom after the description. The system component hardware is unclassified, the receiver exciter hardware is confidential, the OFP is classified secret, and the documentation provided is classified secret. So we have a detailed listing of what is classified about the equipment. and the information aboard it. Briefly describe the consequences if the items described are to be lost to a technologically advanced or competent adversary. Typically, it's going to be that the information could be used to develop countermeasures or could be used in the development of a similar advanced system. This is fairly boilerplate. Watch for situations in which your case might be different, but that boilerplate generally works fairly well. When the release of classified information or technology is within the classification guidelines for disclosure to a foreign government as stipulated in NDP 1, you have 2 more paragraphs that go into the sensitivity of technology. The first is that the determination has been made that the recipient can provide substantially the same degree of protection for the technology, and the sale is necessary in terms of U.S. foreign policy and national security objectives. This will be information provided to DSCA as a classified portion of the package, but it will not be published because we're not talking about the delegated disclosure authority of any country in an open document. When an exception to NDP 1 is required, we have a slightly different statement for number 5. An exception was granted for the release of certain information pertaining to, in the description, under a record of action. And it's important for you to include the record of action number and the date. One important thing I should mention at this point is you should not be submitting a draft notification to DSCA unless all technology, security, and foreign disclosure processes have been completed. Remember that what happens is when the U.S. government formally notifies and makes public its intent to make a sale, that is a clear impression that we're going ahead. If you don't have all your technology releases in place, you risk a false impression in a very embarrassing way. Remember that a 36B notification is always signed off by an Undersecretary of State or above. So the administration is putting its name on the line, and if you haven't made sure that all the clearances are in place, then that could be an extremely embarrassing result for the administration. So this is what a sensitivity of technology transmittal looks like. It's an annex to the rest of the case. In this case, it talks about the F-16s and the sensitive information aboard them. And the determination, this happens to be actually from a different case. This is from a Portuguese case. 36B1 also requires that each numbered certification shall contain an item indicating whether any offset agreement is proposed to be entered into in connection with such a letter of offer to sell if known on the date of transmittal of such certification. So we've already talked about the fact that generally that is not going to be the case. We are not going to know the details of an offset agreement on the date of transmittal of the notification. If we were going to describe that, and I'll show you an example of what it would look like, Section 36G of the law requires that this information be treated as a confidential business information. It's exempt from disclosure, from FOIA. It's not published or disclosed because it's company proprietary information. So there's special handling procedures for that information, and an addendum like that will not be published in the Federal Register. Briefly on offsets, an offset is any industrial or commercial benefit a country requires as a condition to purchase military goods or services. Now you may know that in commercial arrangements, an offset transaction is included in the contract for the item. But in FMS, the U.S. government is not allowed, under the terms of the Defense Production Act, from being involved in administering or encouraging, taking part in an offset transaction. So offset agreements are something that happen apart from the LOA. The U.S. government is not privy to them, but they are arrangements that are made separately between the contractor and the foreign country. But the defense contractor in the United States can include the cost of an offset as a cost of doing business, and they normally build that into line 1. There are 2 types of offsets. Let's talk about those looking at direct and indirect. Let's talk about those looking at a different slide. So here's an example. If I were reporting on an offset agreement with a description, I might say, in conjunction with the proposed sale, Megatech has committed to Bandaria to contract with Bandar Industries to provide manufacturing technology know-how to permit Bandar Industries to manufacture ailerons and landing gears for the Velociraptor fighter. I'm assuming that the Velociraptor fighter is what's for sale in this case. So that provision of pieces for the item being sold is a direct offset. But there's an indirect offset here too. Megatech has committed to fund a school of aeronautical engineering at the University of Bandaria. That is an indirect offset. It's not related directly to one of the items being sold. So those costs are offset costs and the contractor should be estimating them and building them into the unit cost of the fighter. Again, any offset report has to be marked as below, and it'll be delivered to Congress, but won't be established in the Federal Register. There is one other type of report that is required with some notifications, but it's done entirely by state, and I'll mention that a little later. So, now you've got your draft CN underway. There's some other things you need to understand about how the draft notification is handled and staffed. You want to ensure that packages are not forwarded to DSCA for staffing without required documentation and release authorizations. I talked about that before. Make sure all your tech releases are in place. You want to ensure that the case information is appropriately protected until public disclosure is authorized. And I'm going to try and talk about that in a minute. Understanding the process is going to help to manage timing expectations of your customer and your chain of command and provide a basis for better understanding of the types of the information that have to be required to manage the clearance process, apart from the draft notification itself. So the following are required to be submitted to DSCA with the draft CN. SAM C5.1.4 requires a country team assessment, the coordinated position of senior U.S. embassy leadership in support of a proposed sale. It was required for anything that requires a 36B, even if it's a support case that's a follow-on. If it's going to have a 36B, state requires a country team assessment to come with it. And you shouldn't have any problem getting that from the embassy. The embassy is generally going to be in favor of any sale to the country. So as much detail as they provide is useful in providing state the information it needs to justify a sale to the Undersecretary and on the Hill. You want to make sure that you've completed any technology release or foreign disclosure process. Another thing that can be overlooked is an anti-tamper plan approved by the DoD anti-tamper executive agent. The plan has to be approved for any systems or components containing CPI before you can offer an LOA, which means also before you can make a CN. Now that doesn't mean that the anti-tamper plan has to have gone through validation and verification. That can come later, but the plan has to be approved by this point. And finally, everybody is concerned about the time it takes to do a CN. One of the things that you can do to help yourself, because sometimes we don't, is include talking points that explain any timing, urgency, or concern with regard to the CN. If the company is about to start a lot run, if the country is at the end of its fiscal year soon, and that applies some urgency to the timing, explain that timing. Both state and Hill staff are not anxious to see U.S. companies disadvantaged because there was a staffing process that they were involved in that took too long. If you include good information, state will use it and it will help to get your case through. What is really bad, though, what is unhelpful to your case, is to drop a case on the Hill and 2 weeks later say, where's my clearance? I've got to have it now, and here are the reasons, and then force state, not having identified this urgency up front, to march up to the Hill and tell the staffers that they have to get busy on this when there was no indication they should have been. So do yourself that favor, make sure you identify that early on and make sure that state has the talking points it needs. Now, here's one of the hardest things for me to explain and for people to internalize in terms of how information related to a draft CN is handled in DSAMs prior to states authorizing its being treated as FOUO. The issue is this: the timing of public disclosure that the U.S. is contemplating a major arms sale may have significant bilateral and regional foreign policy implications. Imagine for a fact that you have an LOR from two countries that are neighbors that don't get along with each other very well. You can imagine several instances of such. And suppose that you are the one who reveals 2 days before a summit meeting that the U.S. government is about to sell 24 F-16s to this country. Congratulations, you have just single-handedly changed the agenda for a head of state meeting. It may be the last thing you do, but what you want to do is to ensure that the Department of State remains aware and in control of such disclosures. That they can control when the notification will be delivered to Hill, when the press release will be issued, when that is public. In particularly sensitive cases, state will require that the draft notification remain classified at the confidential level until they give the word that it needs to be delivered. That used to be the case in all CNs. But what we have is a process now where the case begins its entry into DSAMS with a masking code so you can't identify the country. DSCA then goes to state, explains basic details of the case, and gets information to treat it with FOU handling procedures until the formal notification goes to Congress, and that's unclassified. People are confused about what part of this is classified. I've got an LOR. The LOR is for this country, and it asks me to get this amount of equipment. Is that classified? No, not unless the country classified it. It's not classified. What's important here in talking about this and realizing what needs to remain classified until that FOU designation for U.S. government purposes is that it's the sum of the parts, the purchaser, the system, and their quantity or value in the context of their inclusion in a formal USG response. What's classified is how the U.S. government might be responding. So I can say, look, I've got an LOR for Bandaria for 1,000 humdingers worth, $1 billion. That is not classified. But if you say, I'm developing an LOA for Bandaria for 1,000 humdingers, that is classified because you put it in the context of its inclusion in a formal USG response. The individual parts, if unclassified in the LOR, remain unclassified and can be discussed in an unclassified environment, provided they're not associated with a USG response that has not yet been formally notified. Context is everything, but put it all together and suggest that the U.S. government is going to respond to a particular country with a particular system and quantity, and you've got classified information until stated said otherwise. So what happens is that IAs, as they begin developing the LOA data, enter all cases requiring 36B notifications into DSAMS using a masking country code. This triggers DSAMS to set an FOU approval milestones so that we'll be able to record and control the classification and the handling of that item. IAs are going to forward the mask case designator to DSCA when they forward the draft notification, and DSCA will forward that package to state, and state will make a decision fairly quickly whether it can be FOUO. And once a state has decided it can be FOUO, DSA will notify the IA and enter one of two milestones to indicate state's decision. If FOU is approved, IAs can replace the masking code with the actual country code. DSAMS is an FOUO system. The documents will print with an FOUO header until the IA has been formed by DSCA, then the notification has been delivered and DSCA has entered the milestone for formal notification. If it's disapproved, the case will remain classified. You'll continue to use the masking country code through staffing, and the IA won't be able to update the case with the actual code until DSCA enters that new milestone to indicate the state has either approved FOUO at some later point or that the formal notification has been delivered to Congress. All right, so now the draft notification has been developed. Basic data has been loaded. We've got our FOUO approval. DSCA now has a draft. It's going to coordinate back to the military department, to DTSA, Defense Technology Security Agency, OSD Policy, OSD Legislative Affairs, and internally within DSCA. Once all those organizations have cleared off, which normally happens fairly quickly, less than a week usually, it's presented to the Department of State's Bureau of Political Military Affairs. And the office there is the Office of Regional Security and Arms Transfers, which handles all things FMS in state. So what will happen is state will then begin their internal clearance process to get permission from the undersecretary. And as they get approvals up the line, they'll have their legislative affairs staffer provide drafts of the draft notification to the majority and minority staff members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. If you hear people talking about this sometime and they make reference to the four horsemen, it's those staffers, the Democratic and Republican staff member on each of those committees. As a matter of practice, the Department of State will not normally provide that clearance until all four have provided their concurrence. And again, the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security is the approving authority in the Department of State for this. Now, you may hear talk of a tiered or concurrent review periods. This is a process that state tried to set up some years ago with the congressional staff to take the place of the old 20-day informal notification. And it's still used, but not adhered to exactly. The idea is for Tier 1 countries. This is NATO plus 5, excluding MTCR Cat 1 UAVs or sensitive systems. The idea is that we would like the staffers to respond to us within 20 days. If they can clear off on that case within 20 days and get back to state, then they will. That's the goal. Now, the original idea was to make that 20 days the subject of a silence procedure, that if we hadn't heard from the staffers in 20 days, we assumed they would be good to go. That was not acceptable to the staff. So this remains a goal, and near the end of 20 days, state may begin calling the staffers, trying to urge them along, but no silence procedure is involved. For non-NATO plus 5 countries, excluding countries that require a qualitative military edge statement with the CN, the standard is 30 days. Now, I didn't talk about a qualitative military edge statement. This is a fairly recent change to the Act within the past 7 years. It's a requirement that for sales to a certain set of countries listed here, that state include a determination that the sale to those countries will not affect the qualitative military edge of Israel in responding to any one of these countries singly or any group of them generally. Israel will still have a qualitative military edge. So for QME sales, or MTCR Cat 1 or otherwise sensitive sales, will allow the Hill up to 40 days. So the idea was that, again, the staffers would notify state sooner if they could, if they have no objection to proceeding, or if not, the idea was the silence procedure would be invoked if they didn't have questions from the chairman or ranking member. In fact, that proved to be a very controversial point with the Hill staff, and the silence procedure, again, has been backed up. So you can get an idea, but no assurance from this timetable for Hill staff review of the case. So when members' questions have been addressed and Hill staff have signaled their agreement, PMRSAT faxes approval for DSCA to deliver the formal notification to Congress. Hard copies of this notification are hand-delivered to the 2 recipients required to get them by law, the Speaker of the House and the Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committees. Now, 36B notifications are typically delivered to Congress only on a day when Congress is in session, except in very rare circumstances and without prior consultation. Congress doesn't have to be in session during the notification period, just the first day. So after that first day, Congress can go in recess, for instance on the August recess, and the period can expire. They just have to be in session when it starts. Generally, you need to remember as well that no notification is submitted in a new calendar year until after the Javits report, which is legally mandated report of potential major sales in the coming year, has been briefed to the Congress. The requirement is that it be delivered to Congress by the 1st of February. The reason it has to be notified on a day when Congress is in session is because Congress does not approve FMS sales. It can disapprove a proposed sale by passing a joint resolution of disapproval, but if it doesn't pass that joint resolution of disapproval within the periods below, 15 days for NATO plus 5 or 30 for others, the LOA can be offered. But as Congress must be present to exercise that authority, formal notification normally begins only while Congress is in session. We would not deliver while they're out of session, making it completely impossible for them to do that. That's the reason behind notifying while Congress is in. Now, the President can waive the congressional review period if he states in his notification, in his certification, that an emergency exists that requires the proposed sale in the national security interest of the U.S. and sets forward a detailed justification, including a description. So again, he has to make the notification. He just doesn't have to wait the 15 or 30 days to expire to be able to offer the LOA. This authority has been delegated to state, but it's been seldom used, only once since 2000 that I'm aware of. Now, upon delivery of the formal notification to Congress, a draft copy of the letter of offered acceptance may be given to the country. If it's necessary, DSAMS will print it out with caveats approved by our General Counsel, warning that it is only a draft and that we are not going to be held to it. And a countersigned LOA can be offered the day after the notification period expires if Congress has not passed a joint resolution of disapproval before the end of the required 15 or 30 calendar day period. Congress has never succeeded in passing a joint resolution of disapproval to prevent an arms transfer. The closest it ever came was during the Reagan administration when they were 1 vote short in the Senate of overriding a presidential veto. But generally, the elaborate and time-consuming clearance process we have means that we aren't going to submit notifications if we know that there's going to be a problem with Congress. And we make pains not to damage our relationship with the congressional staff, with the Hill, in pushing them that far on the transfer. We'll normally try and work things out so that the sale is limited or scoped in a certain way that makes it possible for them to agree. Upon delivery of the formal notification to Congress, DSCA issues a press release. Again, state may adjust the timing, but within a week, a copy of the entire CN delivered to Congress is published in the Federal Register. Those are sample front pages, but if you look on the DSCA website, under major arms sales or in the Federal Register based on a CN transmittal number, you will be able to find those documents and see what they look like. 36B further requires that a CN will be unclassified, that's why we can publish it here, except that the information specified in Clause 2 and Clause 3, again, that's the dollar amount and offer to sell and the number of defense articles and a description of them, may be classified if the public disclosure thereof would be clearly detrimental to the security of the United States. Not the publication of the CN would be detrimental to the purchasing country. We would have to establish that it is detrimental to the security of the United States. In which case, the notification will include a description of the damage to U.S. national security that could be expected to result from public disclosure. So these requirements make classified CNs exceedingly rare. We are generally not capable of reaching that standard of being able to explain a clear detriment to U.S. national security that would allow us to classify a congressional notification. It's something that happens very rarely. So if your country is asking for a classified CN, let us know at DSCA, but the answer is almost certainly going to be it's not possible. It's also a requirement that the President will cause to be published in a timely manner in the Federal Register the full unclassified text. That means, again, we don't have to do a classified sensitivity of technology or offset report or the QME report, which is always classified. But in practical terms, again, CNs can't be classified. They must be made a matter of public record regardless of the purchaser's wishes. So we've made our 36B notification and we've offered our LOA. The law further requires that for a period of 10 years, if what was notified in that CN changes, if there is an increase in the capability or sensitivity of technology, we have to provide a subsequent notification pursuant to Section 36B-5. So we want to help you identify those situations when a follow-on notification may be required and understand the policy limitations on their use and understand how the CN requirements will affect case timing, because they're a little different from B1. Section 36B-5 requires subsequent notifications when the sensitivity of technology or capability of the article or equipment is upgraded or enhanced from what was described in the original notification for a period of up to 10 years after that notification. Now, these are the only grounds for a subsequent notification. The law doesn't have a standard that allows us to readjust, provide CN with a different number for MDE. Sometimes, when we can, we will tell Congress that the addition of additional items of MDE increases the country's capability to do something. We're essentially equating capability with capacity because we don't have another mechanism for advising Congress in this regard. But we try to avoid that if we possibly can. Again, these subsequent notifications are aimed at increasing the sensitivity or capability. And our reason for this might be that a particular missile version goes out of production between the time we made a CN and the time the country has accepted the LOA. Now we're not doing the Humdinger V1. All we have in production is the V2. So we have to go back and tell Congress what that additional capability is. And any Section 36B-5 notification may require a new or revised sensitivity of technology. You would expect it to, since what we're talking about is an increase there. This is the full text of B5A. I want you to have the full text of B5A to see that the notification standard here is very different from B51. If what's happening is we're simply notifying an increase in sensitivity of technology or capability that doesn't have a high cost to it, then that notification to Congress has to happen 45 days before the item is delivered. All right? Now, what that means to us is, as a matter of policy, what we want is the notification to be delivered to the Hill before the item goes on contract. but that's not the legal requirement. If you have a case in which you need to go on contract before we can get that CN up, but well before the 45 days before delivery, then you can talk to DSCA Strategy and our general counsel, and on a case by case, we may permit a contract to be signed before the notification is delivered to the Hill. But that is not the way we like to do business. When you submit that 36B5A, don't just submit your old sensitivity of technology. Describe the manner of the enhancement. How has it been upgraded? Why is that significant? Give us a justification, not for the original sale of the equipment in its lesser capable form, but a justification for that upgrade. And it may be as simple as saying something like, the old version is out of production. It may be that the country has changed its requirements based on some new threat. Whatever it is, spell out a detailed justification. And again, the law makes clear this applies within 10 years after the transmittal. 36B5A, again, notice the difference in notification timing and period. 45 days before the delivery. So 15 and 30 don't apply here. It's 45 days before delivery of the equipment. And again, 10 years. And please pay attention to the fact, again, that the significance and justification are specific to the enhancement and not a repetition. Now, there's a different standard when that increase in sensitivity of technology or capability comes with an increase in case value. Let's say we're now on the Humdinger V2, but the total case value for the Humdinger V2 is going to cost $15 million more of MDE. Well, when that happens, when the sensitivity of technology or increase in capability comes with a notification cost that trips the notification threshold, then we are back to staffing and notifying as if it were a B1. You won't be able to offer the LOA or the amendment until the notification has completed a 15 or 30-day notification period. The advantage of a 36B5C over a new 36B1, well, there's none in terms of timing. But there is in terms of the fact that the law doesn't allow a provision for Congress to pass a joint resolution of disapproval for a 36B5 notification. So you can be sure that the notification should go through if you get it through the staffing process. So, in terms of subsequent notifications, what does it mean to me? What if my LOA winds up with a greater value than that notified in my 36B1 based solely on a price increase? Let's say my original case was a total case value of $110 million, and now it's more than that. Well, as a matter of policy, if the increase in total case value is derived only from a price increase, no additional defense articles or services, no additional capability, nothing changes, it's just a price increase, the company figured the cost wrong, there's generally no need to do a new or additional 36B1 unless the total case value is increasing by either more than 10% or by a CN threshold amount. But do consult with DSCA. So for instance, in the case of my $102 million CN, now my case value has increased by $8 million, just as a straight price increase. Less than 10%, I don't have to do a notification. But if my price increases by $20 million, now it's 122, I've tripped that 10% threshold and I've got to do a new CN to revise that value. If I'm dealing with a very large case and I'm dealing with an increase in MDE, say the country wants to buy 2 more fighter aircraft, and the cost of those fighter aircraft, that MDE cost, is less than 10%, but still trips the congressional notification threshold of $14 million, I've got to do the re-notification. That's the policy standard. What if my case is found to have items of MDE on it that were not notified? Well, you can't sell them without a re-notification 36B1. You might have to start fresh and do a whole new 36B1 or do a 36B5 if applicable. What if my LOA has quantities of MDE greater than those notified? Additional quantities can't be sold without a re-notification of some type. What if it has items that are SME, not MDE, that were not notified or in greater quantities than those notified? Generally, there's no need to do an additional notification for those. Remember that our standard is MDE, not SME. Generally, no need to do a revised notification unless the total case value is increasing by that 10% or CN threshold amount. So, just to recap, we've looked at the requirements of the Arms Export Control Act. Again, encourage you to look at SAM Chapter 5, Section 5 on congressional notification, which include links to the Act and the sections of the Act that apply. We talked about what you need to do in developing a draft, things to watch out for, how to identify MDE, and how to make sure it's accounted for in your draft, how drafts are handled and staffed once they leave your hands, and subsequent notifications pursuant to B5A and B5C. Please take a look at C5 and please forward any questions you have to the email address below, dsca-con-not@dsca.mil. This learning guide is also derived from a one-day-long training that DSCA can provide to your unit that deals with Section 36 notifications in a more comprehensive way and includes more practical exercises and source materials. So if your organization is interested in such a training session, please contact us at that address.